So maybe help us understand how you go about identifying what uniquenesses are with each particular, individual, right? So, is it mold? Is it metals? How do you go about determining those types of things beyond the symptom questionnaire, beyond, the conversation?
So that's really where the labs come into play when we're looking at the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds. Those can be assessed by urine tests for the most part. I've been moving away lately from doing a provoked test for heavy metals just because I'm seeing too much recirculation. So now I'm starting to look at serology tests for looking at the heavy metals. So this is looking at the immune system's reaction to the heavy metals. So I still arm wrestle with myself sometimes to determine whether or not I'm going to test for heavy metals by pushing out the metals and collecting in the urine, or looking at the immune system's reaction to those. But otherwise, I'm looking at chemicals in the urine. I'm looking at mycotoxins in the urine. With the infections, oftentimes I'm looking at it based off of the symptoms. If somebody got COVID and they feel worse since COVID, there's a high likelihood that is long COVID. And so you do have to kind of march it back and look at the chronology. With a number of the other infections like Lyme, they have, and some of its co-infections, they have very specific criteria, very specific symptoms that are associated with them. So if you got pain on the bottom of the feet, cramps, usually in the calves, usually at night, hard time sleeping, and sometimes some anxiety, sometimes some depression, and maybe some thyroid issues, and maybe you've been misdiagnosed as fibromyalgia and you got some muscle pain, it's highly likely that you have something like Bartonella. So we're kind of looking at all those different symptoms plus labs to determine a number of those different causes. Now, one of the things with some of the nuances is about when to test folks, because oftentimes it's more of a question of how much of these toxins they have versus whether they have them or not. So if I'm not sure if I should test for heavy metals or chemicals or molds in an individual because they're more sensitive, or because we're prioritizing other things, then I won't do it. And I will just treat with the knowledge that pretty much everybody that I see has a combination of these. The other thing too is that once we get people into step 3 or out of step 3 and we start to open up the drainage pathways, we get very different test results. And so if we're doing like a mycotoxin test when I first see somebody and that test is negative, it doesn't show anything, that doesn't mean that they don't have mycotoxins, which are mold toxins, in the body. Because let's say we wait 3 months or 4 months or 5 months and we do the test at that time, all of a sudden we see a whole bunch of mycotoxins. So it's not like they've had a new exposure. Oftentimes it's just because the pathways are so clogged that you're not going to get an accurate read on a test. So that's kind of my thinking around the timing of doing those tests as well.
Would you ever consider with somebody on the mycotoxin front provoking them, like using glutathione or N-acetylcysteine in the beginning to get a confirmation, like in the suspicion that maybe they are clogged? That way, if you run the test, you don't get a potential false negative.
Yeah, I used to do that a lot before I switched over to Mosaic Labs, used to be known as Great Plains Labs, is because they had a reagent that reacted with glutathione. And so consequently, they no longer recommended the glutathione provocation. But I have to check to see, because I know that sometimes that can help by pushing out the mycotoxins, as long as people can tolerate the glutathione. And if they can, then oftentimes you can get a more positive result. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, that's exactly right from what I see. I don't use Mosaic, but I do like to provoke, simply because I've seen cases where I had a negative result. And I knew I could smell the mold on their clothes. And it's like I knew there was a mold problem. Why wasn't it coming out? And so in those cases, I've provoked and found like an abundance of mycotoxin. They come out after provocation. So, but I don't always provoke. It's not like the standard that I do, because oftentimes you'll see it even without it having to provoke it. And sometimes, in my experience anyways, when people are mold, if you use glutathione, some of them react to it. Some of them don't do real well. And I don't want to make somebody feel bad over the sake of trying to do a test either. So it's not like standard that everyone gets a glutathione provocation first. Usually I try to find it without it. But
And I think that, historically, oftentimes I find that I don't need the testing initially just because it's like, have you ever lived in a place that had a roof leak, a busted pipe, a flood in the basement? And inherently, people will say the first time you ask them that question, they're like, nah. But then they think more about it and they're like, actually, there was this place that I lived in for this period of time that I did feel worse when I was in. And sometimes they say there was mold on the walls. And if that's the case, it's really significant. But sometimes they'll just say, yeah, there was a busted pipe or something like that. So in general, it's unfortunately way too common, and unfortunately, not enough people understand that it's a big issue.
On that note, how I know there's no way to exact answer this question, but in your experience, how common is it for what you see?
9.5 out of every 10 people,
So,
so
so super common.
it's
Yeah.
so incredibly common. Yeah, mold is just really sinister, and it can cause a lot of the immune system dysfunction that we see that allows other things to come out and play, other infections to come out and play. A lot of the people who have Lyme, they also have mold, and so it's never just one thing, and that's also hard sometimes for people to get their head around.
Yeah, it's multifactorial. I mean, the body is so strong anyway. It has so many redundancies in the immune system. It's when nature has many redundancies of poison, right? That we can become overwhelmed, in that chess match. And I know my experience, maybe you could elaborate your experience. My experience with long COVID has been people were shut down during COVID. And so if they had mold in their house, they just felt worse. And then COVID came and they never got out of their house. Like they never went back to work. They were always in their house. And so they didn't really have an opportunity to get out of their house 10 or 12 hours a day, to be out of the environment that was contributing to part of their problem. That's just something I've seen because I've seen others that were doing really bad. And then when they went back to work, they started doing better.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of how we were able to kind of piece it together.
Yeah, anything that pushes people into the home, here in the Pacific Northwest, it's winter. And so generally I'm out walking, I work from home and my wife works from home and we're out walking several times a day, but it's definitely harder in winter when the rain starts coming, or, you're spending your weekends outside, but then it gets cold in winter, it's snowing outside, whatever it is, anything that brings you inside. So absolutely, I've definitely seen the same thing. And oftentimes I'll tell people, well, let's have you go away someplace, for generally it takes about 5 days, usually to be able for people to tell a difference. And one of the things you taught me was pitch a tent in the backyard if you can, and that's a great way of doing it. That doesn't cost you anything by, having to go to a hotel or something like that, but it gives you a break from your house to see how do you feel? Is your house sick?
Yeah. Once you get a person tested, kind of get an idea for what their toxic burden is or their toxic level is, what are the strategies you use? Are there kind of takeaways that our audience can say, okay, Dr. Evans says, do these things first or don't do these things at all? Like, are there, be wary of these things or definitely these are must-dos?
So I like to start with mold and then heavy metals and chemicals and then the infections. And part of that is because these causes don't live in isolation. So they have this relationship with each other where oftentimes they're feeding off of each other or they're bound to each other. So you've got the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, and the infections all bound up together in what I call like a toxic matrix. And if you start using, like for people who've had Lyme and they start using antibiotics or some sort of treatment, you're basically like grabbing the infection out of there. And what ends up happening is that the toxic matrix opens up and it releases all the things that were attached to that particular infection. So that's going to be the heavy metals, the chemicals, and the molds. And so if you don't have binders on board, if you don't have some chelators on board, then you're not going to be able to bind up some of those things that get released when you start to go after some of these infections. So I do find that setting up that stage appropriately works really well for folks. Oftentimes with mold, it's that combination of binder plus either N-acetylcysteine or glutathione, depending on what they can tolerate. And with the heavy metals, oftentimes I'm using a combination of natural chelators. I work 100% online now, so even though I've got an MD, I don't prescribe anymore, and everything that I do is natural supplements, lifestyle management, etc.
Do you have an opinion? I know what you're doing now, but historically, do you have an opinion, or have you used things like cholestyramine? That's a popular thing to do with mold. What's your take on that?
Yep. Yeah, I used to use that when I had my brick and mortar, and I was prescribing. And yeah, cholestyramine works very well, but it's very hard for people to tolerate. You have to start at very low levels. You have to compound it. It's incredibly expensive. It tastes awful. It constipates people. So, I didn't find it to be that helpful because very few people could actually tolerate it. So I find that there's a number of binders that I use that are generally well tolerated, or we might have to change the dose if they're not well tolerated. But that seems to work really well for folks. And then in terms of the other question, oftentimes from my past that comes up is about, antibiotics for a number of these infections. Well, there's a lot of research on the herbs, and oftentimes when you remove the antibiotics, the infections come back because they just don't get deep enough. And so I do use very potent herbs that will, give people significant Herxheimer's, so we know that they're working. And so we have to definitely navigate that. And that's a lot of the nuances to get rid of these infections. Plus also that I found that you have a lot more success when you're getting rid of the heavy metals, the chemicals, and the molds at the same time as getting rid of the infections.